The gas lamps flickered along Whitechapel Road as Margaret Holloway pressed her shawl tighter against the November fog. It was 1888, and the world she'd known her entire life was dissolving like sugar in tea. At 43 years old, she'd worked in the same textile factory since she was 7. Her fingers permanently stained with indigo dye, her lungs blackened by cotton dust that filled the air like a malevolent spirit. But tonight, as she made her way past the electric streetlight newly installed at the corner of Commercial Street, she stopped and stared upward at its harsh, unwavering glow. For reasons she couldn't articulate, tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. The warm, familiar flicker of gaslight had been replaced by something cold and constant. Nothing, she understood with sudden clarity, would ever be the same again. That electric lamp represented more than illumination. It was a harbinger of transformation so profound that within 50 years, the entire architecture of human civilization would be unrecognizable. The Victorian era wasn't simply another chapter in history's long book. It was the hinge upon which the ancient world swung shut and modernity crashed through the door. What happened during Queen Victoria's 63-year reign would shatter millennia-old patterns of human existence, replacing them with the industrial, technological, globalized reality we still inhabit today. And for people like Margaret, living through that seismic shift meant watching everything familiar crumble, while something terrifying and magnificent took its place. Before we journey deeper into this pivotal moment in human history, I want to take a moment to speak directly with you. These stories, these forgotten voices from our shared past, take considerable time and research to bring to life with accuracy and emotional truth. If you're finding value in this exploration of how the Victorian era reshaped our world, please consider subscribing and joining our growing community of history enthusiasts. Your support allows us to continue uncovering these crucial moments that made us who we are today. Now, let's return to Victorian Britain and understand exactly why nothing was ever the same after that extraordinary, brutal, transformative age. When Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837, Britain was still recognizably medieval in its rhythms. Most people lived in rural villages where their ancestors had lived for generations beyond counting. They rose with the sun and slept with darkness. They travelled by horse or on foot. They knew perhaps 50 people in their entire lives. They worshipped in the same churches where their grandparents had been baptized and buried. Time itself moved differently, slowly, cyclically, bound to the seasons and harvests. A farmer in 1837 would have recognized the daily existence of a farmer from 1537 or even 1037. The fundamental patterns of human life had remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. But beneath the surface of this seemingly eternal world, forces were already gathering that would tear it apart. The steam engine, perfected by James Watt in the late 18th century, had begun its relentless transformation of British industry. Small workshops were giving way to massive factories. Villages were hemorrhaging people to rapidly expanding cities. The landscape itself was being rewritten as railway tracks cut through ancient commons and enclosed fields. When Victoria took the throne, Britain had approximately 3,000 miles of railway track. By the time she died in 1901, that number had exploded to over 20,000 miles. A steel and steam nervous system that fundamentally altered not just transportation, but human consciousness itself. Consider what this meant for ordinary people. Before the railways, distance was measured in days of difficult travel. London to Edinburgh required nearly a week by stagecoach, a journey so arduous that most people never made it. Regional accents were so pronounced that someone from Yorkshire might struggle to understand someone from Cornwall. Each area had its own customs, foods, even time, because with no need for synchronized schedules, noon in Bristol might be 10 minutes before noon in London. The railways obliterated these ancient particularities. Suddenly, London to Edinburgh took 10 hours. People who had never left their villages found themselves in cities hundreds of miles away. Regional dialects began blending and fading. Standard time was imposed across the nation because trains required precise schedules. The very concept of what was near and what was far, who was foreign and who was familiar, underwent a revolution. Thomas Hardy, the great Victorian novelist, captured this transformation with heartbreaking precision. His characters are constantly caught between the old rural world and the new industrial one, unable to fully belong to either. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, the railway literally represents fate, an unstoppable, mechanical force that intrudes into the pastoral landscape and destroys traditional ways of life. Hardy understood that the railways weren't just convenient transportation, they were epistemological weapons that killed the ancient world. But if the railways rewired space, the factories rewired time and labour. The industrial transformation of Britain created an entirely new form of human existence, one so alien to all previous experience that people struggled to comprehend what was happening to them. Factory work wasn't like agricultural labour. It didn't follow natural rhythms. It was relentless, mechanised, divorced from any visible product. A weaver who had once created a complete piece of cloth in their cottage now tended a machine that performed one infinitesimal step in a process they couldn't see or understand. The clock became the new tyrant. Not the sun, not the seasons, but the factory whistle that screamed at 5 in the morning and didn't stop until 14 hours later. The human cost was staggering. Children as young as 5 worked in textile mills, their small fingers ideal for reaching into dangerous machinery. They worked 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, in conditions that seem almost unimaginable today. The air in textile factories was deliberately kept hot and humid to prevent thread breakage, creating an atmosphere thick enough to see, choking with cotton fibres that filled workers' lungs and caused brown lung disease. Children who worked in these conditions often didn't live to see 30. Their spines curved from constant stooping. Their growth was stunted. Many were killed or maimed by the machines they tended. In 1832, a factory inspector named Michael Sadler conducted parliamentary hearings that documented horrors almost beyond belief. Children testified about being beaten to stay awake during 18-hour shifts, about seeing their friends dragged into machinery and killed, about being so exhausted they slept standing up. And yet, people flooded into the cities to work in these hellish factories. Why? Because the alternative was worse. The enclosure movement had privatised common lands that rural people had depended on for generations. Small farmers couldn't compete with mechanised agriculture. The countryside was dying, and the cities offered wages. Meagre, exploitative wages, but wages nonetheless. By 1851, for the first time in human history, more British people lived in cities than in rural areas. This urbanisation happened with unprecedented speed and no planning whatsoever. Cities like Manchester and Leeds exploded from modest towns to industrial metropolises within a single generation. The result was squalor beyond description. In the working-class districts of Victorian cities, multiple families crowded into single rooms. Sewage ran in open gutters. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis ravaged neighbourhoods with the regularity of seasons. Life expectancy in industrial slums was often under 30 years, lower than it had been in the Middle Ages. Friedrich Engels, who spent years documenting conditions in Manchester, described cellars where families lived ankle-deep in sewage, where daylight never penetrated, where the air was so foul it extinguished candles. He described people so malnourished they were literally too weak to work. Children covered in sores, never washed, wearing rags that barely covered their emaciated bodies. This wasn't accidental or temporary. It was the cost of transformation. The wealth being generated by industrialization was real and enormous, but it flowed overwhelmingly upward to factory owners, investors, and the emerging industrial class. The workers who actually created this wealth lived in conditions that shocked even contemporary observers. Charles Dickens built his literary career documenting these horrors, creating characters like Oliver Twist and the Cratchit family whose suffering represented millions of real people. When Dickens described the London slums, the grinding workhouses, the casual cruelty of a system that treated humans as disposable resources, he wasn't exaggerating. If anything, his fictional... But here's what made the Victorian era truly transformative rather than simply horrific. People fought back. The 19th century witnessed the birth of working-class consciousness and organised labour movements that would eventually force systemic change. The Chartist movement of the 1830s and 1840s represented the first mass working-class political movement in history, demanding universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and political representation. Though Chartism failed in its immediate goals, it established the template for labour organising that would gradually win concessions from the ruling class. Trade unions, illegal at the century's start, became recognised institutions by its end. The Factory Acts, beginning in the 1830s and expanding throughout the Victorian era, slowly imposed limits on working hours, particularly for children and women. These changes didn't emerge from benevolence, but from relentless pressure from below, from workers who refused to accept that the new industrial world had to mean perpetual misery. The Victorian era also witnessed the birth of socialism as a political and intellectual force. The Communist Manifesto, published by Marx and Engels in 1848, emerged directly from observing Victorian capitalism's contradictions. Marx, living in London, documented how the same system that produced unprecedented wealth also produced unprecedented poverty, how technological progress coexisted with human degradation. Whether one agrees with Marx's solutions, his diagnosis captured something crucial about the Victorian transformation. It was creating a world of such extreme contradiction that the old categories of understanding no longer applied. This wasn't simply a bad king or failed harvest. This was systematic, structural transformation that required entirely new ways of thinking about society, economics, and human relations. Simultaneously, Victorian Britain became the world's first truly global empire. At its height, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and population. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," wasn't just propaganda. It was literal geographic fact. This expansion wasn't incidental to industrialization. It was essential. The factories required raw materials, cotton from India and America, rubber from Malaysia, minerals from Africa and Australia. They required markets for the goods they produced. The same railways transforming Britain were imposed across India, Africa, and other colonies, not for local benefit but to extract resources more efficiently. The human cost of this imperialism was catastrophic. The Irish famine of 1845 to 1852 killed approximately 1 million people and forced another million to emigrate, all while Ireland continued exporting food to Britain. British rule in India was maintained through periodic brutal suppressions, most infamously the crushing of the 1857 rebellion, which involved mass executions and collective punishments. In Africa, the scramble for colonial territory in the late Victorian period established patterns of exploitation and artificial boundaries, whose consequences still devastate the continent today. Victorian imperialism wrapped itself in the language of civilization and progress. The white man's burden of bringing enlightenment to supposedly backward peoples. But the reality was extraction, subjugation, and cultural destruction on a global scale. What makes this particularly significant is that Victorian imperialism established the template for global capitalism that still structures our world. The system where raw materials flow from the global south to the industrialized north, where wealth accumulates in metropolitan centers while the periphery remains impoverished, where international trade is structured to benefit already powerful nations. All this emerged during the Victorian era. The modern world economy, with all its inequalities and contradictions, is fundamentally Victorian in its architecture. Yet amidst all this exploitation and transformation, the Victorian era also produced genuine intellectual and scientific revolutions that expanded human knowledge in ways that resonate today. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, fundamentally rewrote humanity's understanding of itself. The idea that humans weren't specially created, but evolved through natural selection from other species, was intellectually revolutionary and deeply threatening to traditional religious worldviews. Darwin didn't invent the idea of evolution, but he provided the mechanism, natural selection, that made evolutionary theory scientifically credible. The Victorian debates over Darwinism represented deeper anxieties about the era's transformations. If humanity wasn't special, if the Bible couldn't be read literally, if the old certainties were dissolving, then what remained? Victorian science also gave us the germ theory of disease, finally explaining why cholera and typhus ravaged urban slums and providing the knowledge necessary for public health improvements. Michael Faraday's work on electromagnetism laid the foundation for electrical technology. Charles Babbage conceived of the first mechanical computer. Victorian Britain was a hotbed of scientific discovery precisely because industrialization had created new problems requiring new solutions and generated wealth that could fund pure research. The Victorian era also witnessed profound changes in social relations, particularly regarding gender and sexuality. The doctrine of separate spheres, men in the public world of work and politics, women in the private domestic realm, was articulated with particular force during this period. Middle-class Victorian women were expected to be angels in the house, morally pure, devoted to husband and children, removed from the corrupting influence of public life. This ideology was always contradictory. Working-class women had always worked outside the home by necessity, and the Victorian factories were full of female labourers, including children. But for the middle classes, femininity became increasingly associated with dependence, delicacy, and confinement. Yet this same period produced the first wave of organised feminism. The Langham Place group in the 1850s advocated for women's education and employment. The campaigns for married women's property rights challenged the legal doctrine that wives had no separate existence from their husbands. The suffragette movement, which would dominate early 20th century British politics, emerged directly from Victorian feminism. Women like Barbara Bodichon, Josephine Butler, and Millicent Fawcett fought against the era's gender restrictions, building movements that would eventually win women the vote and legal personhood. Victorian sexuality was similarly contradictory. The popular image of Victorian prudery, covered piano legs, ladies who never mentioned pregnancy, coexisted with a massive sex industry in cities like London. Thousands of prostitutes worked in Victorian London, driven by poverty and the limited options available to working-class women. The Victorian obsession with sexual respectability masked extraordinary hypocrisy. Wealthy men who preached morality frequented brothels. Illegitimate births were common despite public condemnation, and homosexuality flourished in private despite being brutally persecuted in public. The trial and imprisonment of Oscar Wilde in 1895 for gross indecency revealed both the existence of Victorian queer culture and the viciousness with which it could be suppressed. The Victorian transformation of communication technologies was equally profound. The telegraph, perfected in the 1840s, allowed near-instantaneous communication across vast distances for the first time in human history. Messages that would have taken weeks to deliver by ship now arrived in minutes. This radically compressed the world, making global coordination possible in ways previously unimaginable. The first transatlantic telegraph cable, successfully laid in 1866, connected Europe and America in real time. The psychological impact was enormous. The world was shrinking, distances collapsing. When Queen Victoria sent the first transatlantic telegraph message to President James Buchanan, it represented not just a technical achievement, but a fundamental rupture in human experience of space and time. Photography, invented in 1839, changed how people understood and remembered reality. For the first time, events could be documented with mechanical accuracy. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 was the first photographed war, and the images of carnage and suffering brought new awareness of warfare's reality to the British public. Family photography became common by the late Victorian period, creating visual archives of ordinary life unprecedented in human history. This might seem mundane today, but imagine the shift. For all of human history until the Victorian era, most people never saw an accurate image of their own face, never possessed visual records of deceased loved ones, never documented their children's growth. Photography fundamentally altered memory itself. The Victorian transformation of childhood deserves particular attention. The concept of childhood as a protected period of innocence is largely a Victorian invention, though one applied very unevenly across class lines. Middle-class Victorian children experienced a sheltered upbringing dramatically different from both their working-class contemporaries and from previous generations. The Victorians created children's literature as a distinct genre. Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and the works of Robert Louis Stevenson imagined childhood as magical and precious. Simultaneously, working-class children laboured in mines and factories, their childhood stolen by economic necessity. This contradiction drove reform. The social reformer Lord Shaftesbury devoted decades to improving conditions for working children, leading to legislation that gradually restricted child labour. The Education Acts of 1870, 1880 and 1891 established the principle of universal elementary education, making school attendance compulsory and free. This was revolutionary. For the first time, the state accepted responsibility for educating all children, not just elites. The long-term consequences were profound. Universal literacy transformed political participation, cultural production, and social mobility. The working-class autodidact, someone self-taught through reading, became a Victorian archetype, representing the possibility of transcending one's birth circumstances through education. Religious faith underwent its own crisis during the Victorian era. The age began with fairly conventional Christianity dominating British culture, but ended with widespread religious doubt and the emergence of secular worldviews. The Oxford movement sought to reinvigorate Anglican faith, while evangelicals pursued moral reform and missionary work. But Darwin, biblical criticism, and the visible suffering of industrial capitalism challenged traditional religious answers. How could a benevolent God permit the misery of Victorian slums? How could the Bible be literally true when geology demonstrated the Earth's vast age? Cardinal Newman, who converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism, wrote about struggling with doubt. Matthew Arnold's poem, Dover Beach, captured the Victorian sense of faith receding like a tide, leaving only a darkling plain swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight. The Victorian crisis of faith prefigured 20th century secularization, establishing patterns of belief and doubt still recognizable today. The Victorian aesthetic sensibility was equally distinctive. Victorian design celebrated ornamentation, complexity, and accumulation. Middle-class Victorian homes were stuffed with furniture, draped with fabric, covered with decorative objects, maximalism that demonstrated respectability and wealth. Victorian architecture combined Gothic revival, classical elements, and industrial materials in buildings that were simultaneously historicist and modern. The Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, was a cathedral of glass and iron that showcased British industrial supremacy while looking nothing like any previous architecture. Victorian painting ranged from the pre-Raphaelites' medieval nostalgia to gritty social realism documenting urban poverty. This aesthetic complexity reflected deeper Victorian anxieties. The rapid pace of change created profound nostalgia for an imagined stable past, producing the Gothic revival and medievalist movements even as society hurtled forward into modernity. The Victorians were consciously aware of living through transformation, and their art struggled to make sense of it. Dickens's novels are fundamentally about the impact of industrial capitalism on human lives. George Eliot explored how individual moral choices intersect with vast social forces. The Bronte sisters wrote about desire and constraint, about women's limited options in a rigidly stratified society. Victorian literature wasn't just reflecting its era, it was actively trying to understand and critique it. By the late Victorian period, the transformation was undeniable. Britain had become an industrial colossus, the world's dominant economic and military power, a society utterly unlike the one Victoria had inherited. The same technologies that had caused such suffering, the railways, factories, telegraphs, were now accepted parts of everyday life. The generation born in the 1880s grew up assuming trains and telegrams were simply how the world worked. But the costs of transformation remained visible everywhere. The slums still festered. The colonial violence continued. The working class had won some concessions but remained profoundly exploited. Women still lacked the vote and most legal rights. The Victorian Compromise, technological and economic progress alongside social conservatism, was increasingly unstable. Queen Victoria's death in 1901 felt symbolically significant to contemporaries. She had reigned so long, she seemed permanent, embodying an entire era. Her death coincided with the end of comfortable certainties. The new century would bring the catastrophe of World War I, which destroyed European civilization's confidence in inevitable progress. The Victorian faith that technology and industry would naturally improve human life died in the trenches of the Western Front. The British Empire, seemingly invincible in 1901, would be gone by 1950, replaced by American hegemony and anti-colonial liberation movements. But the Victorian transformation didn't end. It accelerated and globalized. The industrial capitalism pioneered in Victorian Britain spread worldwide, remaking Asia, Latin America, and Africa as it had remade Europe. The technologies developed in the Victorian era, railways, telegraphs, steam engines, were refined and supplemented by automobiles, airplanes, radios, computers. The urbanization that had wrenched British people from rural life proceeded globally, and today most humans live in cities their ancestors couldn't have imagined. The global economic system established through Victorian imperialism persists in modified form. The debates about labour, gender, science and faith that roiled Victorian Britain continue today with different specifics but similar underlying tensions. Understanding the Victorian era's transformative power requires recognizing that it established the fundamental structures of modern life. Before the Victorians, humans lived in agricultural societies that had existed for thousands of years. After the Victorians, industrial modernity became inevitable and global. The shift from traditional to modern society, from rural to urban, agricultural to industrial, local to global, religious to secular, static to dynamic, was compressed into a few generations of Victorian transformation. This was traumatic, exhilarating, destructive, creative. But above all, it was total. Margaret Holloway, the textile worker we met at the beginning, died in 1897 from complications of tuberculosis and chronic lung disease, conditions directly caused by her decades in the mills. She never learned to read despite the Education Acts. She never travelled more than 20 miles from her birthplace. She never voted, never owned property, never experienced security or leisure. By most measures, her life was one of unrelieved hardship, and she was one of millions experiencing similar suffering. The progress and transformation of the Victorian era was built on broken bodies and stolen lives, on colonial violence and systematic exploitation. Any honest account must centre this human cost. Yet Margaret also witnessed miracles her grandparents couldn't have imagined. She rode trains that defied traditional conceptions of space. She saw electric lights and photographs. She lived through scientific discoveries that rewrote humanity's place in the cosmos. Her children attended school and learned to read. The labour movements she supported won real improvements in working conditions. The world she left in 1897 was unimaginably different from the one she'd entered in 1854. Whether this constituted progress is a question without simple answers. The Victorian transformation created both terrible suffering and genuine gains, both unprecedented inequality and movements for justice that would eventually constrain capitalism's worst excesses. What's undeniable is that nothing was the same after the Victorian era because it fundamentally rebuilt human civilization from the ground up. It replaced patterns that had endured for millennia with industrial modernity. It created global capitalism and global empire. It gave us railways and factories, photographs and telegrams, feminism and socialism, evolution and universal education. It demonstrated that entire ways of life could be destroyed and recreated within a single human lifetime. The Victorians built the modern world, with all its possibilities and problems, its incredible dynamism and profound injustices, and we're still living in the world they made. Standing under that electric streetlight in Whitechapel, Margaret Holloway understood something was ending. The warm flicker of gaslight, which itself had replaced candlelight within her mother's lifetime, was giving way to the constant glare of electricity. Each innovation made the previous world seem quaint, then incomprehensible, then completely forgotten. Today, we struggle to imagine life before the internet, before television, before automobiles. Our Victorian ancestors struggled similarly to remember life before trains, before factories, before cities. The pace of change they initiated has only accelerated. We're still experiencing the Victorian transformation. It never ended, it just went global and faster. The Victorian era changed the world forever, not through any single invention or event, but through a cascading series of transformations that reinforced and amplified each other. Railways required factories to build them. Factories required urban workers to operate them. Urban workers required new forms of political organization. Global empire required advanced transportation and communication. Everything connected to everything else, creating a system of industrial modernity that was more than the sum of its parts. Once this system emerged, it couldn't be contained or reversed. It transformed Britain, then Europe, then gradually the entire world. It's still transforming us.